Bonjour, good afternoon. Mon nom est Bruno Charbonneau.
My name is Bruno Charbonneau. I'm a professor at the Saint Jean Royal Military College and director of the FrancoPaix Centre at the Raoul-Dandurand chair at UQAM. It's a pleasure to grant you at our last panel on climate security in the Canadian context. So we will be discussing Canada mainly, essentially, and what that means for Canada climate security. I will present our presenters. I will introduce our presenters. This afternoon we have a good mix of university researcher and military and civil, and I'm quite glad to have them with us, and I'm very eager to hear you say something. So without any further delay, I will give the mic to my colleague Will Greaves, who is assistant professor at University of Victoria.
And he will talk about the politics of climate security in Canada. Will.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Greaves, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm presenting to you today a synthesis of two pieces of recent research in which I look at some of the security and the political aspects of security and climate change in the Canadian context. And so much of our conversation today has focused on the international dimensions, extremely important. But if recent events have shown us anything, it's that truly this issue is coming home to roost here as well. And so to that effect, I just want to lay out very, very briefly, but this has been a relatively understudied topic in Canada, that there is a paucity of research that focuses on the Canadian dimensions of climate change and security, although I will note that this is beginning to shift and that there are a number of important initiatives, including this colloquium, which are, I think, redressing this gap in the literature. I have noted here on the slide two important resources that have informed my work, both of them published in 2010, which was a big year, it seems, for climate change and security in Canada. The first by Gordon McBean and colleagues at Western University, looking at the human security dimensions. The second, an important article by Margaret Purdy and Leanne Smythe, which examined in detail the impacts or predicted impacts of climate change on security in Canada. And in their analysis, which I build upon in my own, they outlined three different types of threats that climate change poses to Canada. The first is public safety, the second is national security, and then the third is international security. And in their work, they also noted, as you can see there, that the climate change security nexus has not been, I can barely see, discussed, debated, or analyzed in any serious, sustained, or comprehensive way in Canada, end quote. And so it's very much into that gap which I have tried to position my own work. What I'll be presenting to you today to you very briefly. The first is just a brief overview of an article which I published earlier this year, focusing on precisely this topic, climate change and security in Canada. As you can see, I deviate a little bit from the way in which Purdy and Smythe outlined their analysis. Instead of their three different areas of security, I identify five, which might reflect different things, but I think among others it reflects a deepening awareness of the magnitude of the security implications of climate change for this country. So as you can see there, climate change produces threats to human security in Canada. This is, in a nutshell, threats to the fundamental well-being and survival of Canadians. It produces economic threats to Canada. This is direct threats to the national or regional economies in this country as a result of extreme weather events and other climate-related disruptions. But Canada, as a significant oil-producing, fossil fuel-producing country, also faces other types of economic threats related to the broad issue of climate change. And here I would simply note, quite simply, that we face economic threats should the rest of the world actually proceed with the decarbonizing agenda, the greener, cleaner economic future, which we hope is forthcoming. And Canada doesn't get on board with that quickly enough. We risk quite simply enormous economic losses in this country, although very unevenly distributed across the country, from having not only an existing fossil fuel basis to our economy, roughly 10% of GDP, but also from a deepening fossil fuel basis in our economy as a result of ongoing large-scale investments in the fossil fuel sector. A third area of climate-related threats in Canada are Arctic threats. This, of course, pertains to Canada's vast Arctic land area, its vast Arctic marine coastline, and the very specific range of challenges that produces. It's an enormous part of Canada's total area, around 35 to 40% by landmass, but with a tiny fraction of our population. Less than 0.1% of Canadians live in the north. And as many are aware, most northern communities are very small by population and extremely isolated, lacking overland road access, for instance, to other communities, being in effect extremely vulnerable to climate-related disruption, which, as we've already heard today in an earlier presentation, includes permafrost thawing, which is a significant issue in northern Canada, as it is in other circumpolar states. The fourth area of climate-related threats are humanitarian crises. And this is deliberately broad in the sense that it, I think, should be understood to include humanitarian crises both domestically and internationally. So international humanitarian crises, of course, in circumstances of extreme weather disaster, hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, drought, other similar type phenomena. But as we have seen very, very evidently in recent months, Canada is not immune to these developments here as well. And so this category of humanitarian crises, I would suggest, should also extend to our understanding of the kind of urgency that severe weather disruptions and more chronic forms of climate change are already producing in Canada and therefore very acutely affecting Canadians as well. More on that in a moment. The fifth category of climate-related threats is what I refer to as the risk of radicalization and domestic instability. Again, a very broadly drawn, very broadly conceived security issue here, but I in this article and in other work that I've done, identify these risks occurring at multiple points along the political spectrum. If we understand it as a fairly traditional left-right kind of political spectrum, we are seeing worrying signs of radicalization related to the question of climate change occurring both on the far left and also on the far right of Canadian politics. Now, I want to be very clear that those actors in those different relationships to the issue of climate change understand climate change differently and are potentially engaging in increasingly radical politics for very different reasons and with very different political objectives. But nonetheless, it's climate change which is really a catalyzing factor that is increasingly evident in various forms of social protest, various forms of disruptive direct action, and an increasing risk of violence in various contexts as well. And that given the nature of the Canadian Federation, given the, as is widely understood, decentralized nature of Canadian federalism, given the diverse array of economic interests, but also of social composition and ideological orientations of different regions of the country, I suggest that these kinds of radical politics really do pull at the threads of the national fabric, that they exacerbate existing cleavages within Canada, well-known, well-established, well-studied cleavages within political science, but with potentially worrying consequences, that Canada, which has long lurched from one national unity crisis to another, really does risk having the issue of climate change inflame and aggravate long-standing social and political cleavages in a way that risks the destabilization of our domestic politics and ultimately our constitutional order. Now, just to hopefully provide a brief example of these kinds of phenomena, the province where I currently reside, British Columbia, just in this calendar year, really demonstrates the breadth of challenges that climate change produces. As I'm sure many of you are aware, this has occupied a great deal of media attention in recent weeks, but British Columbia experienced an extremely severe wildfire season in 2021. At the height of the season this past summer, there were more than 1,500 fires burning across the province. Of those, more than 50 were large fires, which means that they were burning more than 1,000 acres. And of those, the largest fire was burning nearly 250,000 acres. So just really vast, vast areas of forest that were consumed in this one wildfire season. And of course, with very severe consequences for human and non-human animal populations. Most notably, most now I would suggest infamously reflected in the complete destruction of the town of Lytton, British Columbia. A town which does not exist any longer, and a town whose future is an open question, whether or not it will be rebuilt, and if so, where and how, and of course, all important, who will pay for it. In this year, British Columbia also experienced this so-called heat dome, which was an unprecedented, although what does that word even mean anymore, heat wave which paralyzed the Pacific Northwest, both the Pacific Northwestern states of the US and most of British Columbia, frankly, for around a month from the middle of June until the middle of July. And this heat dome produced extreme temperatures on a scale hitherto never experienced. It was too hot to move. I can testify to that from personal experience. You found a cool spot and you stayed in it until the heat broke. There really was no other choice if you had one. What the heat dome produced was not only the highest ever recorded temperature in this country, 49.6 degrees Celsius. That, of course, was recorded in the town of Lytton the day before it burnt down, so these things are connected. But it also resulted in at least 600 excess deaths. So that's probably an undercount. There's all kinds of valid reason to suspect that the real number is higher, but we can say with certainty that at least 600 people in British Columbia, in Canada, in a fabulously wealthy and prosperous and generally well-functioning country, lost their lives as a result of this extreme weather event, which is a sign of things to come. We can also say with a high degree of confidence that those excess deaths were not evenly distributed across the population. They're disproportionately borne by particular segments of the population, notably people who are lower income, notably people who are racialized or otherwise socially, economically marginalized, and in this case also people who are older. And so, of course, intersectionality being what it is, people who are all three of those things were at the highest risk of death in the heat dome event. If you were older, poor, and racialized, you had a higher, objectively higher chance of dying. How did that happen? The third event that British Columbia has dealt with this year and remains ongoing, in fact, is this extreme flooding situation. Due to a combination of effects, but aggravated by the wildfires, right? There's a clear relationship between deforestation and flooding events. But more than 18,000 people have been displaced by flooding in British Columbia just in the last 2 weeks. At least 4 people were killed by flooding or landslides. Communication was cut off between entire communities, road access eliminated between whole communities, and indeed transportation between the British Columbia coast, notably the Port of Vancouver, was completely severed with the interior of the province and the rest of the country. There was no means of overland access by road or by rail from BC's westernmost cities and urban area around Metro Vancouver to the rest of the country. Again, a very, very serious magnitude of economic disruption, but also of other associated security and political consequences. Now, in the shockingly short amount of time that's remaining, the other kind of component of this research that I'd like to just introduce you to very briefly has to do with the politics of this. Canada faces a range of these security threats from climate change, and yet we continue not to act as though that were the case. And there has been nothing that could be reasonably interpreted as the construction or acceptance of climate change as a security threat in Canada. And this is something which isn't new. Purdy and Smythe outlined 4 reasons why in their 2010 article. What I've proposed is a 5th missing variable to explain why it is that Canada, to use the more technical term, has failed to securitize climate change, has failed to construct and behave towards the issue of climate change as though it was one of existential threat or survival. And that missing variable, quite frankly, is domestic politics and partisanship. And while I don't have time to develop this argument fully, what I will simply note is that there's a range of, I'll put my 4 key points up, and we hopefully use that as a jumping off point for discussion, but that there are 4 points, all of which are empirically based, which I'd like to leave you with, and which have some cause for optimism, but also I think are the source of the ongoing political contestation that we see around this question. So the first point is that most Canadians do believe in human-caused climate change, which is the good news, of course. However, climate opinion is unevenly divided by region or province. So there are some parts of the country, notably the Montreal metropolitan region, notably Metro Vancouver, southwestern British Columbia, where there's a very, very high level of public agreement with human-caused climate change. And then there are, of course, some parts of the country that have a much lower level of support and, of course, corresponding support for policies that would be appropriate. When we look at the data, and I skipped over all this data, but trust me for the moment that it's there. There is one group that are a very clear outlier in terms of their beliefs and their attitudes towards climate change, not just in terms of its nature, whether it's happening and whether or not humans are responsible for it, but what it means and what we should do, and specifically what's appropriate for government to do as a response. And that group are partisan conservatives. People who identify themselves as conservative, people who respond to surveys and call themselves conservatives, feel quite profoundly different about this issue than do almost any other group of Canadians. Now, admittedly, conservatives themselves are geographically concentrated in some parts of the country, and we should, of course, not be surprised that in the Prairie West, there is therefore also a correspondingly higher level of opposition to some of these propositions. But I would suggest that the root of that isn't something to do with Alberta or Saskatchewan per se. It's rather about partisanship and the underlying partisan motivators. And fourthly, and where we are currently seeing, I think, a lot of contestation in the public policy realm, is that Canadians may broadly agree on the seriousness of climate change, and certainly recent events will aggravate that, but they disagree over how or what is necessary to respond. And this is where we see so much debate and so much acrimonious debate over public policy and carbon pricing and all the many other kind of contemporary aspects of this. All of this combines to undermine our capacity to treat this as a security issue. Security issue requires a high level of social consensus. Security is ultimately socially constructed. It's not objective, it's not neutral. And so long as we have clear political interests that are set against the idea of climate change or against the idea of effective climate policy, we're going to remain mired in this situation where we cannot respond appropriately. And as we're now seeing, there will be very real economic and human consequences as a result. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
You, dear colleague, for having set the table for our next presentators. Next two presentators will be representative from the Ottawa government.
So first, we have 12 minutes, pardon me. Kim Rebenchuk, Director of Domains and Technology Policy at the Department of National Defence, Canada. Kim?
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Centre FrancoPaix and Saint Jean Royal Military College for including us in this important discussion this afternoon, as well as to the Department of National Defence's MINDS program for helping to facilitate the colloquium. My name is Françoise, said is Kim Rebenchuk. I'm the Director of Domains and Technology Policy at the Department of National Defense, and I have a team that covers a pretty wide range of policy issues, ranging from cyber and space policy to the Arctic and climate change and security. So I'm hoping today just to share some observations with you, along with my colleague Alison from Global Affairs Canada, regarding the impacts of climate change on Canada's defense and security, as well as our defense and foreign policy responses to address these risks. Avant d'aller plus loin, je voudrais noter que même si je prononcerai mes remarques en anglais, parce que c'est la langue avec laquelle je suis le plus à l'aise, je serai heureuse de prendre vos questions, commentaires en anglais ou en français. So climate change is the greatest threat that we face as a global community. It is a threat with long-term consequences. And already today, we need only scan the headlines to observe its devastating effects on people's lives, homes, and livelihoods. We can anticipate that these effects will only become more acute over the coming years and decades, with the impacts we see today growing in frequency and intensity. Impacts will be different for every region. Some will face greater risk from drought. Northern populations will experience degradation of permafrost and unpredictable ice conditions. Coastal communities may be confronted with rising sea levels, increased erosion, and more frequent and intense storms. As I speak, and as was just noted, the province of British Columbia is facing devastating impacts of rainstorms and extreme flooding. The direct and indirect consequences of climate change will have marked impacts on the security of Canadians and people around the world. For this reason, like many of our global partners, Canada is working to ensure that climate change is a key consideration of our defense and security thinking and activity, as I'll try to lay out in my remarks. Together with our colleagues throughout government, we are working with our allies and partners internationally to address the shared security challenges posed by climate change. I'll now try and say a few words on the impact of climate change on Canada's security and defense interests and on the Canadian Armed Forces. Canada's defense policy, strong, secure, engaged, recognize the serious and complex security threats posed by climate change. However, those threats are evolving at a pace that we did not fully anticipate when we developed the policy in 2017. Climate change increasingly presents immediate and long-term security challenges for Canada. This will place added and competing pressures on both the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces, who may be called upon by government and Canada at any given time to undertake missions for the protection of Canada and Canadians and to maintain international peace and stability. First, climate change is contributing to higher operational demands on the Canadian Armed Forces. An increase in the frequency and severity of natural disasters and extreme weather events is imposing added demands on our military for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, both internationally and domestically. CAF deployments to respond to events attributed to climate change have increased in the past decade. So between 1990 and 2010, there were 6 of those deployments. We saw 30 from 2011 to 2020. And in just 1 month of this year, just July of 2021, the CAF deployed on 4 separate domestic operations in response to floods and forest fires. And today there are over 500 CAF personnel out in British Columbia. So extreme weather conditions, including overly cold, hot, humid, and dry environments, also put at risk the health and safety of our deployed personnel, so our folks overseas. The rapidly changing Arctic environment is drawing both state and non-state actors to our Arctic and northern region for tourism, economic opportunities, and more. This increases the need for government efforts to monitor the region and safeguard our citizens and our national interests. Globally, we see that climate change contributes to vulnerability, instability, and even to conflict. We see that climate change effects can exacerbate national or regional tensions, contribute to human displacement, and increase competition for resources such as food and water. When instability does erupt into conflict or when stabilization is needed, this can obviously lead to greater demands on the Canadian military to deploy abroad. Second, in terms of the Canadian Armed Forces, we are seeing that climate change is affecting critical defense infrastructure and equipment. So flood damage, increased maintenance requirements, disruptions to energy and water access, damage from degrading permafrost to real property assets for surveillance, loss of access to ice roads, changes in heating and cooling cycles, all impact built and natural infrastructure on which the CAF relies. This includes infrastructure critical for mission support, for training, for force readiness that supports and facilitates our military operations both at home and overseas. Further, we're seeing the life expectancy and the readiness of land, air, and naval assets, so the big equipment fleets are adversely impacted by the harsher conditions that they encounter on a more frequent basis. So going forward, we'll need to consider how best to meet these growing demands without undermining the ability of the military to fulfill the core responsibilities it holds. Canadian defense and security officials have been tracking the implications of climate change, and we are working to address them through both adaptation and mitigation efforts. We know we have a lot more to do, and we know that exchanges with our allies and global partners will be mutually beneficial as we address the range of challenges that we currently face. We already have a handful of initiatives underway, of which I'd like to highlight a few for you this afternoon. So first, the Department of National Defence and Global Affairs Canada have both recently established very modest, I would just say very, very modest climate and security policy functions. These teams, one of which is in my shop, are working in very close partnership with one another and with other partners across the government. We hope that this will allow us to better integrate and align our efforts to address climate security risks at home and abroad with domestic stakeholders, other departments, other levels of government, and international partners and allies as well. In addition, the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force are all conducting thorough reviews of the impact of climate change on their activities. And it is hoped that the results of these reviews will help to inform future planning decisions related to force structure, operational plans, equipment, training requirements, as well as facilitating our adaptation to the future operating environment. We are also developing a climate change adaptation risk framework, which will enable the national defense to protect our programs and critical infrastructure. And a modest climate intelligence assessment capacity is being built within Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, this to meet the growing interest in climate change and security. This team is focusing on awareness, monitoring, and early warning, including the effects of climate change on areas such as the Middle East and Africa, where it could have a potentially significant impact on current and future deployments of the military. And then finally, in terms of initiatives, I'd note that we are not undertaking these activities alone. We're doing them in concert with our allies and global partners and with the whole of government community, the Canadian academic sector, and provinces and territories. National defense and the security sector are also looking at mitigation. So we recognize the responsibility that we hold as the defense community, not only to address the symptoms of climate change, but the root causes as well. We know that we have a responsibility to mitigate our emissions in the defense sector and to improve our environmental stewardship while preserving our operational capabilities. As you all, I think almost always hear when defense is involved in these conversations, defense is one of Canada's largest employers and maintainers of equipment and infrastructure, including over 20,000 buildings across the country. And as a result, we do represent almost half of the federal government's greenhouse gas emissions. As such, we are undertaking efforts to reduce emissions to support the government's low carbon target. We're doing this by implementing energy performance contracts, by purchasing renewable power, by greening our commercial vehicle fleet, and by investing in energy efficient buildings across the country. These activities have us on track at the moment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2025, so 5 years ahead of the 2030 target. And then we are also working on top of that to meet the new federal target set out in the Greening Government Strategy. So that was a target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Significantly, the inclusion of our operational fleets in Canada's commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is a challenging and ambitious national commitment that we are working to implement. So to support that, the Air Force and Navy are conducting decarbonization studies of their operational fleets to reduce emissions while preserving operational and interoperable effectiveness, and we are also sharing best practices with the Canadian Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who have also committed to reach net zero emissions from their operational fleets. We recognize the need to ensure interoperability with our allies and to operate globally as we move towards our net zero goals. So we will share lessons learned and best practices with them and seek to learn from them as well. I'd also like to mention the Defense Energy and Environment Strategy. You might hear this referred to as the Ds. These were updated in the fall of 2020, and they provide a roadmap for reducing our emissions across the defense team while remaining operationally effective. And then the last thing I'd like to mention is that we are working with researchers, the private sector, and academia to increase our knowledge and develop innovative solutions to the operational and security challenges posed by climate change. So one really good example of that is what is called the Amaze Project, or Advanced Microgrids Towards Arctic Zero Emissions. This is a project with Defence Research and Development Canada that seeks to modernize the power and energy system of Canada's North Warning Radar system through innovative technology solutions and reduce reliance on fossil fuels and lower greenhouse gas emissions. So we're really excited to see the outcomes of the Amaze project and what we might be able to learn from that going forward. I'm getting very close to wrapping up. I'd like to say a few words about the NATO Centre of Excellence. So obviously we are seeing climate change as a global threat, and we believe firmly that no one country has the solution to the global security challenges it presents. So recognizing this, Canada is committed, obviously, to working with our allies and partners to collectively advance solutions for the benefit of all. So you will have heard, I am sure, in June of 2021 at the NATO Leaders Summit, Canada's Prime Minister announced our intent to establish and host a NATO Climate and Security Centre of Excellence. The NATO Alliance itself began a renewed and ambitious effort in 2021 to address the security impacts of climate change, and Canada will actively support this particular line of work for the benefits of all. The Climate Security Centre of Excellence is an essential part of these efforts, and I am going to end my comments on that here because my colleague Alison Grant, who will speak in a few minutes, will tell you more about the Climate and Security Centre of Excellence and Canada's part in addressing climate security challenges within the global community. So just a few final thoughts from me before I pass to Alison. Canada is dedicating significant effort to integrating climate change into our defense and security policies and practices. Ultimately, we want to achieve a more strategic approach to integrating climate change issues into all defense and security activities, including policy, planning, research and development, procurement, infrastructure, and operations. We know that success will require transformative change in our institutions, as well as considerable investments. It will also require focused leadership and a true dedication to cooperative action. As we develop our knowledge and practices, we hope to share these as much as possible and also to learn from the experiences of our partners across the world and in Canada. Faced with the common threat to humanity that climate change presents, we believe we must cooperate as never before if we are to keep our respective nations and citizens safe and secure. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to taking part in the discussion that will follow.
Merci beaucoup. Je cède immédiatement donc la parole à Alison Grant, Executive Director of the Security and Defense Relations Division at Global Affairs Canada. Alison, thank you for being with us. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup et bonjour à tous et toutes.
Thank you very much and welcome to all this afternoon. As Kim just mentioned, I will be presenting in English, but certainly questions will be accepted in both languages.
So I'd like to begin by echoing Kim's thanks to Centre FrancoPaix and RMC Saint-Jean for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you. And you've mentioned I'm the Executive Director for Security and Defense Relations at Global Affairs. I'm new in my job here. It's been a couple months, and I'm coming from being director for Eastern Europe and Eurasia, so more of a geographic focus, but certainly one that is security focused and one that has a climate context as well. But now I'm heading up a team that is very much responsible at Global Affairs for supporting the linkages between Canada and the rest of the world that are required to protect and advance our security interests. And this means really a focus on alliances, multilateral security arrangements, but also a number of informal bilateral and multilateral mechanisms Canada uses to promote and protect its security interests. And these are the linkages that I'd like to speak more about today in my remarks as I present the foreign policy perspective to complement the defense overview just given by Kim. And indeed, it's great to follow Kim as well. Our teams are, as she mentioned, working very closely together on dozens of issues, and climate security is a prime example where our partnership is growing. So specifically, I'd like to lay out two major themes in Canada's foreign policy approach to climate security, to climate change and security. And these are first, working with partners across the globe, and second, connecting parties across a range of sectors. And then finally, I'll explain how we intend to promote this kind of approach through the initiative that Kim mentioned, the NATO Centre of Excellence for Climate and Security. Although I can't steal too much thunder there because I know tomorrow you're having a panel that will specifically talk about the center. And in fact, my interim director for the center, Blair Brimmel, who I'm sure is watching the presentation today too, will be leading on that tomorrow. So we won't go too much in depth there. So climate change equals global problems equals global solutions. Applying, of course, Canada's strengths to address world problems is what Global Affairs Canada is here to help us do. But we're also here to, of course, bring the strength and solutions that the world has to offer back home to Canada. Linkages between our domestic experts and practitioners, both within and outside government, with partners and stakeholders abroad are vital to address the evolving problem of climate change security impacts. No one nation, of course, has all the answers when it comes to this issue, and a world of isolated efforts, however earnest, won't work. So for this reason, we are pursuing global climate security cooperation in both Canada's bilateral relationships and as part of our multilateral engagement. I'll note in particular our engagement through two institutions active on climate and security, the United Nations and NATO. Within the UN, Canada is a member of the group of Friends on Climate and Security, whose aims include promoting the UN's institutional responses to climate-related security risks and boosting the UN's involvement in this area. Canada is providing important support also to UN institutions working to address the links between climate change, fragility, and conflict. This includes significant support to the UN Peacebuilding Fund. Within NATO, which is directly in my division, an institution I'm responsible for, Canada is a very active supporter of the Alliance's ambitious climate change and security agenda and action plan, which Kim mentioned was adopted earlier this year at the NATO summit in June. It really is an increasing area of focus for NATO, climate and security, given the recognition among allies that climate change will have a significant impact on alliance security interests over coming decades. NATO's 30 allies are jointly pursuing efforts to build their awareness of climate security implications and to adapt to identified security risks. Allies are also seeking ways to contribute to the larger global imperative of climate change mitigation through efforts to lower emissions and reduce the climate impacts of military and defense work. I'll mention the Center of Excellence in a few minutes, but I'd also like to mention that NATO is also working at refining its strategic concept, which is the major concept that sets out the alliance's strategy and outlines NATO's purpose and fundamental security tasks. And this is a capstone, one of NATO's capstone documents, and there is active discussion underway at what NATO's new strategic concept should look like. We're hoping to wrap those discussions up by the summit in June, NATO's upcoming summit. And I can tell you that Canada is actively involved in looking at how NATO is going to be addressing new emerging security challenges, one of them being climate. So that is certainly, I was hoping to be able to come to this talk today with a bit of output from the NATO Foreign Ministerial that was just held yesterday, in fact, in Riga on that topic, but I don't have all the reporting out yet. But rest assured that Canada and the Canadian, our foreign minister who took part in the ministerial talked specifically about the issue of climate security and how that affects NATO's strategic concept. So again, I'll come to the Center of Excellence in a minute. And for here, I just simply note that through our global relationships, Canada is learning from friends and partners and allies, and also bringing our perspective and expertise to bear on global climate and security work. That certainly is not just through multilateral arrangements, and I mentioned UN and NATO, but through a range of our bilateral interactions as well. Even over the past few days, we had a flurry of 2 ministerials that I was responsible for in Europe, where our foreign minister participated, NATO and the OSCE, and in a range of bilateral interactions that she has had over the past couple of days with foreign ministers, and is still having likely tomorrow, climate change and security registers in a number of those bilateral conversations, and is a major topic of discussion with some of our key like-minded. Turning to another type of needed linkage now, I'll explain why we're emphasizing a multi-sectoral response to the climate and security issue. Clearly, the problem of climate change is as complex as it is pervasive. The dangers associated with climate effects are wide-ranging, from direct threats to life and livelihoods to more indirect contributions to human, national, ecological, and even global insecurity. We often hear climate change called a threat multiplier. The risks, of course, vary from region to region, community to community, and even household to household. In our foreign policy approach, we remain conscious that intersecting identity factors, be it gender identity, orientation, age, race, ethnicity, class, disability, can increase the insecurity that individuals or groups may face from climate change effects. The Women, Peace and Security agenda also informs our climate and security approach. We should not forget that women are not only impacted differently by climate change, they're also leaders and agents of change in their communities, working on the front lines of climate change mitigation, response, and recovery to help build resilience. When looking for the solutions to climate security impacts, and in alignment with Canada's feminist foreign policy, we recognize the imperative to both hear and meaningfully include a diversity of men's and women's voices in climate and security decision-making. So clearly, with complex causes and diverse implications, simple or one-dimensional responses to climate and security won't cut it. Actors in the security field, including international security policy officials like myself, need to be prepared to respond to the dire extremes of the climate security spectrum. And this includes national and global scale security threats. Canada is not limiting its climate security focus to only such worst case end state impacts. This would be neither a sustainable nor a practical way to uphold our foreign policy or security interests. We need instead to work across the climate security spectrum and to forge climate and security solutions and not just responses. Already we see and are supportive of the triple nexus approach to global issues. This term refers to the interlinkages between humanitarian, development, and peace actors. And it's an important model to apply to climate security to ensure interventions at each point on the spectrum promote security. A multilateral approach to climate security, however, must involve triple nexus actors plus, I would say, hard security actors, including defense and military, as well as industry, science, academia, and civil society. So a triple nexus plus. All of these have a part to play in addressing climate change and its security impacts. Global Affairs Canada and our partners are seeking to gradually promote such interlinkages and break down silos. The work has already begun within the broader government of Canada. I already spoke briefly about Global Affairs Canada's partnership with the Department of National Defence on security issues, including climate and security. But another example is Global Affairs' work with Environment and Climate Change Canada. We work with ECCC and others to pursue global efforts and provide climate finance for climate change mitigation, as well as adaptation and resilience building. You will have just seen in June this year that Canada doubled its previous commitment, pledging $5.3 billion over 5 years, including increased funds for adaptation and nature-based solutions globally. Canada also has a part to play in helping to create and support links between commercial, industrial, scientific partners and other actors in Canada and the rest of the world. Encouragingly,
on a perdu Alison. We lost Alison. So we'll just move with then the next speaker. Our next speaker, for academics like me, we've all read his work. Simon Dalby is professor of at the Balsillie, School of International Affairs at Wilfried Laurier University, and he's also a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation. And he'll probably reply to some of the things that have been said so far and talked about whether climate security needs a new paradigm, or we should talk about security from a new or different paradigm. Simon, thank you for being with us. Your turn.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you, but apologies for not making it to Montreal, but between finishing my book manuscript earlier in the week and having to teach this afternoon, it was just not feasible. So what I did yesterday was simply put together a short paper trying to come at this from, yes, a new paradigm perspective. I'm delighted to see that both the Canadian Armed Forces and Defence folks, as well as the Global Affairs, are tackling this from their perspectives comprehensively. It's late in the day, but it's really good to see this happening. And I want to just say that nothing that follows is to denigrate their efforts. My audience is actually for sort of a larger academic question that is posed implicitly by Bruno's title for this workshop, which is simply, do we need a new paradigm? And I stopped and thought about this. I do actually have a copy of, and I realize you're probably seeing all this backwards, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Tom Kuhn's famous book about paradigms, suggesting that, is it backwards? Yeah, and Hans Morgenthau's Politics Amongst Nations, which is another prop for my talk, is also backwards over my other shoulder there. But anyway, never mind. The point about this is to stop and think, well, what is meant in a paradigm, and what paradigms are we operating with in terms of security? And given the enormity of climate change, how might we work backwards and think much more carefully about the world and how it's being changed? I've been having to do this because I was on the hook for this book that I've been working on now for the last 18 months or so, just called Rethinking Environmental Security, and the manuscript is finally done, but it required me to go back and think a lot harder about, well, how do we actually think about this notion of security? Back to Morgenthau and his classic text on realism, in which he sort of explicitly talks about power as what it's all about. Read the first chapter, it's just the first few sentences, it's right there. That's the task that we have to engage. And one ends up very quickly thinking in military terms, in terms of firepower, the ability to impose one's will on an opponent using fire in its various dimensions, both propulsion and explosive capabilities is crucial to the military arts. And as the technologies become ever more sophisticated, that doesn't change much. The crucial argument about this is that the militaries are there to ultimately ensure national security for individual states. But we are now facing a situation where it seems to me that we can draw some parallels from the classic discussions about national security, particularly the emergence of this notion of the security dilemma earlier in the second, or in the post-Second World War period. Because there the argument is from John Hurst in particular, we build up our arms to protect ourselves, we make others insecure because they feel like we are threatening them. They build arms and then we say, look, they're building weapons, we need more, and the classic spiraling of arms races and so on. This is the classic problem in the Cold War period. How many nukes were enough? Well, by the time we got to the 1980s, both the Soviet Union and the US had multiple tens of thousands of them each. And indeed, I started thinking about this stuff and saying, well, what on earth do we need to that number of weapons for? I mean, that was really the question that started me off down the track on thinking through all this stuff. More recently, I've sort of noted that the consequence of using large numbers of those nuclear weapons back in the early 80s really scared me seriously, because as a geographer thinking about ecology, reading the stuff on nuclear winter, it was like, whoa, we actually have the ability to disrupt agricultural systems, to disrupt economic systems in dramatic ways that will really bring civilization to an end should major nuclear war happen. The parallel with our current situation suggests that we are facing, in the medium to long term, unless we act, a similar potential devastating consequences on that scale. If one reads carefully the science on Earth systems, if one reads carefully the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, particularly the 2018 report on a 1.5 Celsius world, clearly we are on a trajectory for major climate disruptions well beyond anything that we have seen, even in the storms that Will has summarized in the last few weeks in their impact in British Columbia. And the sheer scale of what we face down the road is what worries the climate scientists and people like me that read that stuff. I don't do it, but I do read it. And think about that context. So the large problem that we face is, I would argue, another kind of firepower endangering us. Too many nukes in the Cold War suggested security dilemmas that really did endanger us. Now too much firepower in the other sense of the use of fossil fuels to power everything. Well, 80% of our energy system is based on fossil fuels globally. This is another in danger that is coming back to bite us unless we get a handle on it very quickly. So what I'm actually trying to say here is that we face a new kind of security dilemma. What we are using to secure our mode of life is coming back to bite us with the potential massive disruptions of the climate system in coming decades, unless we get a handle on it and fairly soon. The problem with climate change, of course, is it isn't like most other pollution issues. It's not a matter of turning off the taps and then the problem goes away, because the longer you wait, the more carbon dioxide you end up in the atmosphere and the worse the disruptions down the line are. Dancery's response to a question in this morning, one of this morning's sessions, was sort of saying, well, we're just sort of layering on climate onto existing institutions and thinking in terms of short term. And of course, this is precisely the problem. That it's great for D&D and for global affairs. Obviously, you have to do that, and I'm glad to see that there are people in both institutions now doing this. But the more fundamental questions about security go beyond that, in terms of can we rein in this other form of firepower quickly enough to avert major climate disruptions down the road. And that really is the question that both the dramatic changes in the Arctic and the kind of storm events and heat dome that Will has summarized a few minutes ago these are simply precursors of the kind of disruptions that are likely to come unless we rapidly stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And I think we need to think about the long-term consequences of short-term decisions. And the time problem on this is fundamentally different to most public policy issues, precisely because this builds up and accumulates. And that's one of the real issues with carbon dioxide. So hence, it's logical to argue that really what needs to be done for long-term Canadian security and for everybody else's security is to dramatically reduce carbon dioxide emissions quickly. Net zero, I would just like zero, never mind the net by 2050. And I think that's what we need to focus on. There's too many fudge factors in a lot of the net stuff, but at least as an interim policy objective, let's do it. But recognize that we're going to have to drop the net bit down the road as we get a bit closer to getting serious about zero. The point I'm trying to make about this is summarized in Joanna Neumann's formulation, not of a security dilemma, but of a security paradox, where the short-term securing of our fossil fuel supplies that we need to run our societies is coming at the long-term threat to the stability of the climate system. And the agricultural and infrastructure systems that we have built for a civilization of 8 billion people simply will not be able to deal with a dramatically disrupted world. And if we keep putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, an increasingly rapidly disrupted world, the further we get into the future. And that's the context in which we really need to think about security now, not in terms of protecting ourselves, but in terms of what we're making, what we're producing. Because the Earth system science literature is very clear on the fact that we have a new element loose in the Earth system, the so-called technosphere, which is dramatically changing how the Earth system functions. And how we shape that technosphere, in other words, what we make and how we make it, is absolutely crucial to the long-term survival of something that looks like a contemporary civilization. And I think we need to be very clear about the fact that this production problem is the major issue for long-term security. It's not something that Global Affairs or Department of Defense can actually get a handle on directly, to which the normal response is, yeah, but Dalby, look, that's not security, that's production, or it's development, or it's something else. But unless we get a handle on that, then the security consequences are likely to get worse and worse. Which cycles back to an old argument from 2007, when British thinkers were tackling this. And Nick Mabey wrote a paper for the White House, for Ruzzi's Whitehall paper series, in which he posed the question, who in modern societies has the responsibility for thinking about long-term existential threats to contemporary states? Big pause, well, who does? And his argument was that, in fact, the security sector and the intelligence agencies in particular had an alert and warning function, which they needed to bring clearly into the center of government decision-making, because clearly there is a major existential threat if we don't get a handle on this. And the urgency of getting a handle on climate change, of course, is that events now have consequences decades in the future. What I've been trying to grapple with in this little paper that I sent around is, can we think then about security explicitly in a world after firepower, where we are not burning stuff to live well, where we focus explicitly on the fact that trying to dominate using fire in both its military and its wider combustion uses. Can we focus in on this as the key geophysical process that we have to grapple with? This is perhaps too abstract for most policymakers, because that's not how we think about the world. but well, I'm an academic and thinking about the world and the long-term future is the kind of stuff I do. And what I've been trying to grapple with is the appropriate metaphors to try and grapple with both the seriousness, but also the very immediate necessity of thinking about how it is that we constrain firepower. In the Cold War, of course, we did that because we began to realize that, wait a minute, these proliferating nukes are simply too dangerous. And we went to various arm control mechanisms to try and get a handle on it. This is what the COP process, Glasgow, the latest one based on Paris, is trying to do. But the urgency of moving on this is a bit different from the arms control issue, insofar as the longer we wait, the worse it gets in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's system. So, banning coal, as some of my colleagues have suggested, really needs to be done urgently, is a different way of trying to get a handle on this. And it's analogous to arms control insofar as you don't make weapons that are just too lethal or too dangerous or can't be controlled. The analogy seems to me to work well in the security sector. My final point is simply that we also need to recognize, and again, this is something that is standard in security studies, the crucial dangers, of course, in terms of thinking about foreign affairs and international security is, well, how do others see us? Ethnocentrism plagues security studies more so than perhaps many fields. But in terms of the Canadian role on this, we are the worst emission producers. We've got the worst record in the G7. According to some people's numbers, we're probably not as bad as the Australians, but they're not in the G7. The point here being that for all our talk about climate, we have not been reducing emissions. We are building more fossil fuel infrastructure, and that simply makes everything worse. And in terms of being taken seriously in international fora, we need to get our own act together here so we can make credible statements about reducing our emissions, which will then finally suggest to people internationally that we're actually serious about this. Because if we wish to be taken seriously, we do need to get our huge, relatively speaking, emissions per capita under control. That is outside the normal agenda of defense and global affairs mandates, and I understand that. But somehow the Canadian institutional frameworks that we operate in have to grapple with this, and we have to think about the next economy, how we actually reduce the vulnerabilities of our existing infrastructure while simultaneously building an economy that does not rely on fossil fuels. And that sort of production question, development question, yes, it's a triple nexus, I think, very clearly, Alison. And I think we need to push that debate much further into the Canadian political conversation. To Will's point about the partisan difficulties with this, my colleagues Jatin Nathwani and Gerald have recently suggested we need there was a Royal Commission kind of thing on this. In my own CG paper earlier this year, we were actually suggesting a parliamentary process to debate this, to try to get this out of the partisan dimensions of all of this. Because in my final point is simply to Will's point, my standard comment is there's nothing remotely conservative about assuming you can burn your way to perpetual prosperity. It's going to undermine precisely what conservatives value most, the continuity of traditional institutions, family life, and so on. Because that is what is in stake in this climate change. Securing that should be at the heart of what most conservatives are about, but we've got ourselves ideologically twisted into knots on this one. And a larger Canadian conversation about this seems to me to be crucial beyond the mandates of both the government institutions that are doing their bit here. And how we do that as Canadians, as academics, seems to me to be an absolutely crucial part of this conversation, which has to get beyond the technical definitions. And I'm hoping that some of those metaphors I'm playing with might engage security scholars at least to try to extend that discussion beyond the formats that we have been doing, which are, as Janice said earlier, sort of layering on and short term. That's me for my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Simon. Very interesting talk. We have Alison back, so maybe Alison, in a minute, could you conclude what you were?
I know, I'm so sorry. What a horrible time to cut out. And anyways, so I'd really a minute on the NATO Centre then, because I know that is quite of interest and you will get a chance to talk about it tomorrow. But the big news is that we have now presented our official offer on the NATO Centre of Excellence on Climate and Security that follows up on the Prime Minister's announcement last year. So we've submitted it to NATO and presented it at NATO's Military Committee, in fact, earlier this week, which is an exciting step. And really what it means is we've kickstarted the Centre of Excellence establishment process now. And it is Global Affairs and the Department of National Defense that are leading that process. There's a lot of interest in the center. The specifics of its design and its focus and its mandate are going to be worked out with our allies over the coming months, but informed also by other stakeholders. So I'm hoping for good and robust consultations as we now have kicked off this formal establishment process. And as much as possible, too, people ask, well, is this, is the point of the NATO Centre of Excellence to be for NATO, for allies only? Obviously, that is, it is a NATO organization and will be a NATO international military organization that's under the command and control of NATO allies. But as much as possible, we would and we do want it to be one that is working with the global community and has very significant outreach globally. So in terms of how it's, how it will be structured, Canada will be the framework nation, obviously, of the Centre for Excellence, meaning we're the host. We will chair the steering board, have the director position likely, but there'll be a number of NATO allies that will come in as sponsoring nations. There are a number of NATO allies that are really involved in climate security, and we're hoping to, we know there'll be a high level of interest, and we're hoping to bring them in. What are the benefits to Canada for this center? I mean, of course, in addition to showing a strong contribution to NATO, I think it's some of the things that Simon, you just touched on, and the benefits it'll bring back. I think it will, well, first off, it will drastically increase the number of partnerships working to adapt to the impacts of climate change and security here, and partnerships that we are fostering. It'll also provide allies and Canada a central location to pool knowledge and develop preparedness and responses to the security impacts of climate change. And it provides a platform for outreach to other global actors from inside Canada. So I think what we should hopefully end up seeing is a real increase in domestic expertise as well in climate and security among government, but also industry and academia, of course, and increased access for Canada as well to allied knowledge and expertise with this center. So again, I know you'll talk about it tomorrow, but happy to answer any general questions in the Q&A. That'll wrap. That was really quick. I'd expected to say more, and I'm sorry to get cut out, but happy to answer any questions on NATO or any of our bilateral or multilateral security discussions with partners on climate security. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Last but not least, our last speaker is special guest, retired Major General Randy Key, U.S. Air Force, Senior Advisor, Arctic Security Affairs, and I think now runs the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. Welcome, General. The floor is yours.
Bonjour, and my apologies for only being able to address this conversation in English. My French skills are just far too weak for me to even try or trot them out for you today. First of all, as the American on the panel, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion to listen and learn from the tremendous set of reflections provided first by Will, then by Kim and Alison and Simon. Just tremendous set of reflections. I'll try to, as the discussion here, just take a few brief reflections from this. In advance, I would just like a brief introduction of the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. It's Department of Defense of the United States' 6th regional center. And this is one uniquely focused on the Arctic region. We join a number of other centers, many of which are probably well familiar with Canada, in particular the George C. Marshall Center for European Security Studies in Garmisch, Germany, and the Daniel K. Inouye Center for Asia Pacific Security Studies located in Honolulu. The Center of Western Hemisphere Defense Studies, now known as the William J. Perry Center, located in Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., is one that many Canadians may have interacted with in the past. These centers, of course, are focused as unique tools within the kit bag of the Department of Defense to engage internationally, whole of society, and really are people-oriented activities. They, of course, conduct education, executive education specifically, engagement outreach, and research analysis. One of the things that our center is just being established in this last summer, and it is one mission charge in this is advancing the impacts of climate change in the Arctic region. So climate security is very much in the kit bag of the mission task we have to develop research analysis, executive education, and engagement programs to address. So that is a bit of a backdrop. And again, as the American on this panel, first of all, I will not. I'll be able to address those things that make sense to me as an American, but there's insights within the Canadian context that certainly will elude my perspective. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to address some of the aspects that Will had made brief mention to in the aspects of climate change and security across Canada. And certainly his examples in British Columbia are things that affect us here in Alaska. I'm actually coming to you from Anchorage, Alaska, where the temperature right now is 5 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. This has been the coldest start of winter in more than 30 years by some expert opinions. The Chukchi sea ice, for example, advancement is the fastest again in 30 years. It follows one of the more coolest summers we've had on record. And so as you all were enduring in British Columbia, that heat dome that affected the northwest of the United States as well as south and western Canada, we are experiencing an exceptionally cool summer. And so the aspect of climate change, understanding the elements in it, is certainly much more needs to be done in understanding the science behind this. Arctic oscillation, just one piece of this, affects, of course, in the overall climate equation. As a career math major and operator, I always try to figure out, do we know all the factors, and all the factors are well known? But I am not a scientist, so I will say up front, I can just say that when you look at the challenge, though, that is facing all of us, and some of the aspects, of course, Will's perspective on the idea of understanding the threat, certainly the dimension of human security, there is a great impact on economics, obviously. And someone who worries every moment of every day about the Arctic region, certainly climate change is felt strongly across the Arctic region. The Arctic is now being listed as about 3 to 4 times the rate of change compared to at the lower latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. The one thing I'm struck by, though, is the radicalization of domestic instability. And the fact is, I'm drawn to a relatively old remark from L.A. Rice in the early 1990s by a gentleman who says, well, why can't we just get along? Can we find consensus? Certainly from my vantage point, there is much more for us to focus on in trying to address this as a common concern. And yes, there is better understanding now that the Arctic as one region, but really the climate overall is where we're seeing change, is how do we deal with not only characterizing it, understanding this is a problem, but what are the antidotes? Certainly human beings across the time span of recorded history are not very good at conservation measures. There are certainly examples that where people on the planet have gotten along and figured out how to conserve, but generally it's not a strong skill set of human beings. So to me, I keep asking, and again, as a former U.S. Arctic Research Commissioner, are there antidotes to address the fact as we work to try to reduce the factors that cause climate change? Are there actually antidotes that actually have some potential to be put in by the community of science and to be made at scale in a way to reduce the impacts of climate change as, again, this carbon continues to rise across this? And so can we gain consensus? Can the science community actually come across ideas that would address some of the root causes of this? And, as a way, for example, I've heard some folks give the idea that, how do you reduce the amount of carbon rise? Well, then reduce the oxidation process and photosynthesis. So where can you find areas that are desertification and utilize resources to increase the transformation of carbon dioxide into oxygen and really enhance this away at scale? Now, the reality, though, is that this is going to take much more time to work through. in thinking through this, but the idea of the paradigm, if you will, that Simon well hit on, is one paradigm that we thought enough about the aspects of antidotes to this challenge. The need, though, for less acrimony and more debate to figure out solutions, to me, makes more sense. But we've got to find a way that we realize that the common threat that affects no matter everyone where you stand or sit, it affects us all because of all the factors that Will identified, is the aspect, of course, understanding that we do have a significant global problem. How do we find solutions that are actually implementable at scale, but also adaptable to different regions? Because there is no one-size-fits-all solution here. Kim's remarks, I would just offer that, I appreciate everything as someone who's in the Department of Defense of the United States, DND's efforts for addressing climate and thinking through the aspects of where the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and Royal Canadian Air Force are looking to try and find solutions to address their carbonization aspects and reduce the impacts while still accomplishing the mission as assigned to provide for the defense of Canadian interests. Certainly, this is the same challenge that the United States military is facing, and looking through solutions. We know that how can technology essentially work solutions that could reduce that carbon footprint while also making sure that we don't collectively lose sight of the mission that's required for us to accomplish. The same goes, of course, for the reflections from Alison. And I will share just a brief moment in looking at the NATO Climate Security Center of Excellence. I look forward to, and the Stead Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies, establishing a partner relationship. I think there's a great opportunity as that new center is established. And someone who cares deeply about Canada-US initiatives, I look forward to finding ways that the Stevens Center can conduct outreach and collaboration and partnership, especially in their research analysis, but also engagement. And again, education seminars with this new NATO COE. I've worked with NATO COEs in the past while stationed in Europe, and certainly this is a great opportunity for Canada, a great opportunity for the Alliance. So I'm thrilled about that new move and that great new initiative. Because I think strategically this gets to what some of the provocative thinking of Simon. And I've worked with a number of Arctic researchers now for nearly 6 years of my post-Air Force life. And the idea about different paradigms, I think, is critical. How do we avoid echo chambers? How do we remain agile? How do we remain relevant? How do we follow the data wherever the data goes? And how do we remain agilely understanding as data changes? To me, this is the paradigm, is that we're remaining relevant, realistic, understanding, and trying to find a way to de-escalate. Certainly, I know that messaging matters, and understanding the communication is really both a transmitter and a receiver, and then back and forth. How do we understand in a way that what's being messaged to us is being understood how the messenger intended it to be received? And this aspect about firepower, I love the Cold War example. We did find a way to constrain. And ultimately, we find a way to constrain in this new paradigm. We can't burn our way to prosperity. I love that perspective. I think is really important for us to think through, though. Not only is it about conservation, and based on the weakness of human beings, how do we find antidotes that actually do address the problem? And again, technology has helped us through the history of mankind. How do we find a new paradigm of technology to address this in a substantial way to reduce the threat? Because again, getting back to what Will said at the beginning, it is about human security. And human security, and when you look at the terms of 8 billion people, certainly 8 billion people simply are going to produce more CO2. How do we find ways to, there may be possibility to get to zero, but certainly technology is the principal driver in finding ways to reduce the threat for economies, for overall traditional security, and also reducing the chance of humanitarian crisis that could really stop the forward progress of mankind. So, Bruno, I would respectfully give the floor to you. Those are my very brief set of reflections. I congratulate the distinguished speakers, and it's a privilege to join you on this stage, coming to you from Anchorage, Alaska. Thank you again. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, General. So we have just over 15 minutes for question period. So while people figure out what they want to ask, maybe have a brief or a general question for the panel. Throughout the day, during the panel, throughout the day, and Simon put it in a particular way as well, there are different understandings of what security is, human security, hardcore security, so on and so forth. Another way of asking the question, perhaps, I would put to the panel is whose responsibility it is it, or should it be, to do climate security? Simon challenged, I think, or certainly raised the question, well, Global Affairs Department of National Defense can do certain things, but ultimately they cannot solve the issue, the core issue of ending fossil fuel use, for instance. So if we're talking about climate security, whose responsibility it is. So I'm throwing this out there. If you want to try to answer that one, it's kind of obviously an open question, but I see that here in the room we have at least Christian who wants to ask a question. Christian, vas-y.
So if we think back to the early 1940s and we found ourselves in a situation where we had gone through the new 30 Years' War and the calamity where we looked back and we said to ourselves, we can never let this happen again. The political, the human, the economic, the social disruption, harm caused. And we developed a strategy for post-war world that Canada, the United States, and some key European allies came together with the Atlantic Charter and generated, I think, a second half of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, that in some ways made us an amazingly stable society, made North America the most prosperous, harmonious continent the world had ever known, by deciding that we're going to work together and that the threats of the world came from elsewhere. And a vision that constituted not just a set of values, but the institutions that allowed us to operationalize those. And so we've heard a lot, and I think on this panel, about what needs to be done. But I think, what does the strategy look like? What does the strategy for climate security look like that can replicate what we did in the early 1940s, looking back and saying we can never let this happen again, where we can now look forward and we can say together, this cannot happen, because none of us want to live in the world that Simon here and in other writings and others sort of have laid out for us. And what I haven't heard yet is, what does the strategy look like? There's all sorts of stuff that we can do. We can get together and we can throw our resources together and stuff, but what's the strategy? Where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there? And how can the COE, how can the binational and bilateral relationship with the United States, and how can the multilateral relationship with NATO help us get there?
Merci.
Maybe I just didn't listen well enough.
We will. You want to go first, please?
Well, thank you for that question, Christian, and I'd like to connect it to Bruno's prompt as well, and I think that they're in many ways asking the same question, and I'm sure there are many different answers, but the one that pops to mind immediately for me is that when we think about the real nature of climate change as a phenomenon and as a social problem and as a security threat, ultimately there are consequences or symptoms of climate change which the military, the armed forces, the security services will be involved in and may even play a leading role in. But the idea that those particular agencies can solve the problem completely misunderstands the problem. They cannot, and we shouldn't expect them to. It completely outstrips their functions, their training, their capabilities in every respect. And so the question of who needs to fix it, I think, is intimately connected with what you've posed here, Christian. I appreciate that. What happened at the end of the Second World War, in the aftermath of this destruction and this death and the promises that the new world would be different, was a new social contract which emerged, where those soldiers returning to the front in Canada, or from the front in Canada, returning home to the United States, and then those who were in Europe who sought to rebuild their societies, did so more or less on the basis of a new social contract, what we now call the welfare state, which has at its core a kind of promise of the good life. You did this, you served, you fought, you suffered, and your society thanks you and will reward you now with Of course, the details differ, but an education, a home, employment security, and the provision of certain basic welfare, goods, which you deserve, which you've earned, and which the society will now provide you. And that forms the basis for the Western way of living ever since. The problem is this, that conception of the good life is fossil fueled. The very fundamental way in which our societies rebuilt after the war and innovated after the war is one that really lays the built foundation of much of the climate crisis as it currently exists. It's the era of fossil fuel expansion, it's the era of suburbia, it's the era of personal automobile ownership, and that vision of the good life, to connect to an earlier panel and our colleague from Florida State University, I believe, who was talking about development, that vision of the good life doesn't just become what we pursued domestically to extraordinary success. It becomes the vision of the good life and the Western way of living that we've been quite busily exporting elsewhere ever since. And the climate problem has been deepened at every step as more and more places and peoples around the world have embraced the model of living that we in the West, and not we currently, but my grandparents' generation, role modeled and made extremely desirable, and quite literally made the selling feature of the Western way of life. And so part of the difficulty that we're in is that we are 3 generations deep into that conception of the good life. That's the way we were all raised, that's where our parents were mostly raised, and that's the way that our grandparents wanted it to be, because on some level they didn't understand the full consequences of the world they were building. So the challenge that we are faced with is having to undo that. Is to understand what of that, of course, must be kept, what of that is important to how we are and who we want to be, but also understanding fully now the very, very harmful, the deleterious consequences of that vision of the good life, and it must be undone. It must be undone in our own societies. That's what decarbonization means, in my interpretation. And I think this is tremendously important. We must stop selling it as a vision globally. We must stop allowing this conception of fossil-fueled, individualized, radically isolated humanity to be the conception that is increasingly adopted by people in China, in South Asia, and in the African continent, and these other, very, very, of course, heavily populous parts of the world, because all of that is utterly untenable in a climate-stabilized world. And so, to the question of who has to do something about it, without in any way suggesting the government and institutions and corporations can't or shouldn't change, it very much is us. It very much is we, the extraordinarily fossil-fueled citizens of the West, the wealthy people of the world, by any reasonable measure.
Well, we can keep going on with the virtue signaling and stuff. I get all that. Okay?
It's not virtue signaling, it's answering your question.
But here's the geopolitical problem, right? Decarbonization and deindustrialization are in effect a strategy that plays right into the hands of China and our authoritarian adversaries, right? What does China want? It wants to make sure that we shift as much of the industrial production from the West to China, that we maximize the amount of money that we borrow to do this from China in order to finance our carbon transition. And we know that the carbon transition is ruinously expensive. And so that will essentially then indebt our countries in a way to China that essentially will enable China and enable China's growth. And I think China is prepared to do this at considerable cost to the planet and considerable cost to itself, because I think there's an authoritarian regime here. So I think the challenge here is, one of the reasons we have multilateral institutions such as NATO, because we also have a particular conception of the way we understand our societies and of the way we understand political, democratic, economic, social stability. And so I think simply saying decarbonization is the answer misses the geopolitical and geostrategic context in which we're trying to operationalize this. And part of the reason why I think if we're going to have a NATO COE, it needs to recognize that we're dealing with an adversary where simply pursuing a route of decarbonization and deindustrialization will not simply be the answer. So how do we operationalize this in a way that doesn't implicitly play into China's hands and enable our key authoritarian adversary and their particular vision of the world? And make no mistake, this is not a revisionist power. It is a power that is looking to overturn the international order that we built at the end of the Second World War. So simply saying that order doesn't work anymore and we should overturn it also plays into China's hands. So I think it's not as easy as you lay it out to be.
I don't want to monopolize the response, but I'd like to respond to that quickly, because just because you don't like the answer doesn't mean it's not an answer. Secondly, though, I don't think China wants to overturn that order. They want to co-opt it. They want to lead it. But they are hugely beneficiaries of that order, as we've seen in the last 20 years with Chinese economic growth. What I think often gets missed in the framing around China as a geostrategic adversary and as being a potential spoiler in the global climate regime and the need for decarbonization is that in many assessments, it's climate change and environmental degradation domestically within China that poses the single greatest threat to political stability of the Communist Party and China's own domestic regime. So I think it's one-sided to characterize China as only being poised to benefit, from this transformation, in the sense of benefiting in terms of financing our own transformation, when in fact there is tremendous domestic benefit that is in fact perhaps not in our interest if it solidifies the position of the Communist Party, but which is profoundly in the self-interest of China because they have a population that is acutely vulnerable to these climate disruptions as well. We have not yet seen the kinds of effects or disaster that we saw in British Columbia in the last several weeks and months play out in the Yangtze River Delta, for instance, on the scale that would potentially destabilize China's domestic stability. I don't at all see China as being on one side of this question. To the extent that we in the West have been, I think, half-hearted at best in this process, China is interested in benefiting from our ambivalence and will position themselves appropriately. But there is tremendous downside risk to them and their regime and their system of continuing on the path that we are on. And I don't think that because of their greater capacity for long-term planning, they're in any way unaware of that or of the greater benefits that they stand to experience should an actual decarbonizing transformation get underway.
Thank you. I see the general has raised his hand. I would just say let's not also underestimate the interdependence of all of this. I think that Chinese growth is linked to what you're talking about the good life, and so it's not so much state versus state as far as I'm concerned if we're going down that road. But anyway, sorry, go ahead, General. I see General and maybe Simon as well. I'm not sure, but General.
I could. Alison and I both put our hands up at the same time. As a gentleman, please allow me to defer to Alison. I'll follow in on her.
Okay, yeah. Who's first, Alison?
Sure. My comments will be pretty brief. I just wanted to jump in on the two questions. The first one being whose responsibility is it to do climate security? I think that Will just answered it, and I agree with him that it's those that are causing climate insecurity that are responsible for doing climate security. I'm probably paraphrasing you, Will, and sorry, but that's my answer. And in a way, it's relevant, Simon, to your points too on the paradigm of arms control and who managed that issue and who solved that issue. Well, it were the responsible powers at the time who were causing the arms insecurity. So the second question is, what does the strategy look like? And I think in the last conversation here, it perhaps was framed as how can we operationalize our approach to climate security? Obviously, I talked a lot about NATO, but we can provide solutions, all the solutions through NATO. And I think that one of the very first step, and we've started to do that, is really to ensure that it is on the agenda. And it's not just at NATO, but it's on the top agenda when security organizations are meeting, and other groups as well that deal with security and insecurity, such as G7 with G20 and others, that that climate insecurity is on the top of the agenda. And I think that has to be a way to operationalize the tandem approach and strategy that we will need to have to climate and security, which is on one hand to have comprehensive measures to adapt and enhance resiliency in the face of climate security threats, and on the other hand to have ambitious climate change mitigation measures. So that's how I would kind of try to succinctly sum up what the strategy should be. Thanks.
First of all, Christian, I appreciate your question. As someone who spent a lot of time as a military planner, strategies are based on three facets: ends, ways, and means. Obviously, I think when you look at the strategy of the case, the ends, the objectives, the goals you're looking for is to reduce and eliminate the impacts of or at least work towards elimination of a changing climate that really impacts this human security dimension, as again, going to the aspects that Will had mentioned at the beginning. The ways, of course, are a series of lines of effort that are really whole of nation and whole of national communities to then is forced on the construct of consensus. You can look at some of the multinational efforts that are in recent history, Paris and Edinburgh, et cetera. But there's essentially trying to get to lines of effort that would essentially find ways to obviously transition our dependency on fossil fuels in a way that is, and I say this in a transition standpoint, where your energy alternatives, you have relevant alternatives to fossil fuel driven economies and industry, and transportation is just one example of that. There needs to be, of course, the means, and that means these things don't happen unless there is essentially the resourcing part of the equation. A lot of strategies become aspirational because, frankly, they're not well resourced. So I just say it in. Gaining consensus on the objectives at the ends, finding through a community of effort the various ways, and this is, again, to me, technology is one piece of this and one very important piece of this equation. Conservation measures and more do help. And I do think that the combination of technologies and conservation measures do matter. But lastly, without the resourcing aspects, we're going to be hard pressed to realize an alternative future that really does reduce the chances of human-caused climate changes having a deleterious effect on overall human security. Back to you, Bruno. Thank you.
Thank you, General. And for last words, I think I am seeing Simon's hands up. So maybe in a minute, please. Yeah.
Just a couple of comments on this. First of all, the crucial point is that much of the Cold War was about protecting ourselves from external threats. The point about the emissions and greenhouse gas implications of the kind of lifestyle that Will was discussing is that we are the problem. The climate problem is us. It's not an external threat. And this is why conventional security has so much difficulty, because it presupposes a given entity which is protected from some external difficulty. But the difficulty is that the internal entity is the prime mover on causing climate change, and hence has to be the place where the solution starts. And I think that basic philosophical problem is at the heart of much of what the cultural politics of climate is all about. It's difficult, but it just simply has to be grappled with. As to the question of the price of decarbonization, I mean, I think Nicholas Stern was quite right 15 years ago, and when he made the simple argument is the cost of not doing it are going to be a whole lot worse than the cost of actually tackling it. And I don't think the math on the economics of any of that has changed. There's a huge infrastructure deficit made a whole lot worse in British Columbia in the last few weeks that needs addressing, and addressing it in ways that does not lock in future fossil fuel consumption has to be a key design criteria. And across the United States, there's a big debate these days about infrastructure and how to invest in it. And that simply needs to be done. And I think that goes to the sort of the changing ideological circumstances of our times, wherein it's becoming clear, at least to the younger generation, in some parts of the younger generation, that the political economy that we're living in at the moment, which is not providing them with reliable futures, simply has to be changed. And I think to Will's point about the welfare state in the 1940s, we clearly need a new social contract now, which makes it clear that we do actually take the needs of youthful folks seriously in how we replan our investments in the next few years, because that, in terms of building back after the pandemic, has to build back in a way that doesn't lock in long-term fossil fuel consumption. Because if we don't get this right in the next little while, then we are dooming future generations to an increasingly disrupted and difficult world.
Thank you very much, Simon. So that concludes this panel and our day. Je veux remercier donc.
Let me thank all the panelists today, the members of the panel for the entire day, our speakers for a little bit from around the world who joined us at this conference. We finished on a debate and a very, very And I think we can continue. We'll be able to continue that debate. Let me thank all those who are responsible for the organization, all those who are with us from the beginning. And this will all be recorded, and it'll be on our website of the, and on the Raoul-Dandurand Chair YouTube channel. So look for the YouTube channel. Thank you for our translators, technical team, the Françoise, she's still here, and Alex, they're both here. She's as resilient as ever. Thank you for one and all. Thank you very much. Okay.